How could a man be this wicked to his dear wife? Watch and listen as we unravel every bit of the story. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's proceed. Adaobi sat quietly on the edge of their king-size bed, cradling her stomach with trembling hands, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything all at once. The quiet hum of the air conditioner did little to silence the roar inside her chest. The memory of 6 miscarriages haunted every breath. 37, yet aged beyond her years, she moved with the caution of a woman who'd known too much grief. The man she once called her husband, Obiora, barely spoke to her anymore unless it was to blame her for something. A missed appointment, a bad press release, a lukewarm meal. He walked past her now as though she were furniture, only offering a glance when guests were around. To the outside world, she was the lucky wife of a rising businessman. But within these marble walls, she was an afterthought, an empty womb in his eyes. Yet, within her, hope bloomed timidly again. She hadn't told him she was pregnant. Not this time. Not after the last time when he scoffed and said, "Let's not get our hopes up just to bury another dream." So she held the news close to her heart, praying this time would be different. Every flutter she felt brought both joy and fear. She prayed over the unborn child nightly, whispering words of life into her belly while Obiora fell asleep beside her, scrolling through his phone and smiling at messages she would never be allowed to read. Obiora paced across his home office, his voice slick with charm as he spoke to Chica over the phone, promising her the world, and a wedding that would make headlines. Chica, a flamboyant, light-skinned interior designer 10 years younger than Adaobi, had become his obsession. She laughed loudly through the call, tossing out color palettes for their ceremony, suggesting floral arches and imported wine. Obiora, ever the image-driven strategist, saw the affair not as betrayal, but as an upgrade. Behind Adaobi's back, he'd begun liquidating joint investments and funneling assets into shell accounts under fake business names. He justified it as self-preservation. After all, Adaobi had become too docile, too spiritual, too fragile. And she had failed him where it mattered most, producing an heir. So when Chica, wild and unbothered, entered the picture and whispered that he deserved more, he began to believe her. His phone buzzed, an RSVP from a governor for the wedding. He smirked. He had planned everything, including divorcing Adaobi after the wedding to avoid scandal. She would be fine, he thought. He'd already arranged for her to be comfortably sent back to her uncle's house in Port Harcourt. In his mind, she was already history. Adaobi winced as a wave of sharp pain clawed through her lower abdomen. She'd kept quiet about the cramps for days, hoping it was just fatigue, but that morning, the pain was unbearable. Barefoot, she reached Obiora's office in tears, whispering that something was wrong. He stared at her from behind his desk, annoyed, then stood reluctantly. "Get dressed," he said, not offering a hand. The drive to the hospital was silent. No comforting words. No glance in her direction. When they arrived at the emergency entrance, he barely waited for the door to open before muttering, "Let me know when the doctor says something serious." She looked at him through teary eyes as the security helped her into a wheelchair. "Obiora, please don't leave," she whispered. But he was already reversing the car, his destination fixed. Lekki Phase 1, where a wedding rehearsal with Chica was in full swing. Back in the hospital, Adaobi clutched the armrests as another contraction hit. Nurses rushed her into emergency. Her blood pressure spiked. Her vision blurred. "Call her husband," one nurse shouted. "Number switched off," another replied. As they prepped her for surgery, she whispered a final prayer. "God, let this one live. Even if I don't." The blinding lights of the operating room faded into warm white as Adaobi slowly opened her eyes. The faint sound of babies crying echoed somewhere near, and for a moment, she thought she was dreaming until a soft voice said, "You did it, Ma. Twin boys." Tears rolled down her cheeks uncontrollably as she whispered, "They made it?" The nurse nodded and pressed her hand. "They're strong and healthy." Adaobi choked out a laugh and cry in one. But her moment of peace was cut short when Muna, her younger cousin, walked in holding her phone like it had exploded in her hands. "Ani, please. I don't even know how to say this." She turned the screen to Adaobi. There, all over social media, were pictures of Obiora and Chica dressed in white, hands raised, confetti in the air. "Welcome Mr. and Mrs. Obiora Nwachukwu," the caption read. It was trending. Adaobi froze. She didn't blink. Didn't breathe. Her arms instinctively folded across her chest as if to shield her heart. The silence around her felt louder than a scream. Her body trembled, not from labor but from betrayal so deep it cut through her bones. She looked at her sons. God didn't just give me babies, she whispered to herself. He gave me witnesses. 3 days later, as Muna helped Adaobi pack her things into the hospital bag for discharge, her hand brushed against a thick brown envelope buried beneath her wrapper. "What's this?" Muna asked. Adaobi shrugged tiredly. "Something that lawyer brought after Daddy's burial. I never looked inside." Curious, Muna opened it. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first page. "Auntie, you need to see this." Adaobi, holding one baby while the other slept, looked on warily. Muna sat on the bed, breathless. "This is a signed document from your late dad's lawyer. You were named the major shareholder in Omenka Oil. 15% equity. It's worth over $5 billion. All they needed was your signature to activate it." Adaobi blinked. "What are you saying?" "This is real, Auntie. Look, board approval, legal stamp, valuation summary. Your father never told you because he wanted it sealed until the right time. Maybe now is the time." Adaobi stared at her sleeping sons, a new realization dawning. The very man who abandoned her was clueless. The real inheritance wasn't just in her womb. It had been in her name all along. Barrister Morty arrived at the hospital unannounced, his gray beard well-groomed, briefcase in hand, and eyes soft with restrained pride. Adaobi blinked in surprise as he entered her private ward and bowed slightly. "Your father prepared for days like this," he said gently, pulling a thick folder from his case. "He didn't tell many people because he knew some truths only make sense when the time is right." Adaobi listened in silence as he explained the content of the deal. Her father, a quiet stakeholder in Omenka Oil, had legally transferred 15% of the company's shares to her name before his death. The folder only required her final signature to activate the deal. "But why me?" she asked, still cradling her newborns. Morty smiled. "Because you were always the one who carried burdens with grace. He saw your strength even when you were silent." Then came the shocker. Obiora had once read part of the file. A year ago, while snooping through her drawer, he found the folder but tossed it aside, assuming it was another failed inheritance or unrealized dream. "He called it a waste of time," Morty added softly. Adaobi clenched her jaw. That same man left her bleeding in labor to marry someone else. Morty slid a pen across the bed table. "Sign it only when you're ready. But once you do, the empire you thought you lost will stand behind you." Chica spun in a silk robe on the balcony of Adaobi's former home, her long curls bouncing as she showed off the gold-ringed bathroom taps on her live stream. "When God finally remembers his favorite daughter," she shouted playfully, while followers sent fire emojis and congratulations. Adaobi, still healing from a cesarean section, saw the videos through Muna's phone but said nothing. Chica paraded the house like a queen claiming her new throne. Sitting in Adaobi's favorite chair, flaunting Obiora's gifts, and mocking unnamed baby mamas in vague tweets that clearly pointed to her. What Chica didn't know was that behind the scenes, Adaobi's signature had already triggered a cascade of calls from legal boards and oil executives. While Chica flaunted vanity, Adaobi met discreetly with Omenka's chairman over a virtual call, her hospital gown replaced with a kaftan, her newborns asleep beside her. "We've awaited your signature for 5 years," the chairman said. "It's good to finally meet the rightful heir." And while the world saw Adaobi as the abandoned wife, the corporate world was buzzing with whispers. "She's back. And she holds more power than anyone thought." Meanwhile, Chica celebrated a wedding built on deceit, unaware the ground beneath her Louboutin heels was already cracking. Adaobi stepped out of the hospital days later, not into a taxi, but into a black SUV sent by one of her father's trusted business friends, Chief Ocone. Her new home wasn't in a guest room or relative's flat. It was in a secured estate in Banana Island, paid for through corporate dividends now linked to her name. While she adjusted to her new life with the twins, Obiora, smug and confident, arranged to sell their former house in Lekki, Adaobi's house. A wealthy buyer showed interest, and papers were drawn. But during property verification, the land documents bore only one name, Mrs. Adaobi Nwachukwu. Enraged, Obiora contacted the lawyer he used for the sale. "How is her name still on everything?" he barked. The lawyer explained the shocking truth. All assets jointly held were tied to the oil deal her father's trust backed, and Obiora had signed away his controlling rights long ago when he rushed paperwork during his desperation for capital. Now, not only could he not sell the house, but his name had been flagged in corporate red tape. He stood outside the house he abandoned, watching Chica apply lip gloss by the window, clueless that it no longer belonged to either of them. The empire he thought he was building now rested in the hands of the woman he discarded. The decline was slow at first, missed calls from creditors, quiet warnings from suppliers, but by the end of the second week, Obiora's financial crisis exploded like a grenade. The bank began seizing company vehicles. Staff salaries bounced. His construction deals collapsed overnight, all tied to the false assumption that Adaobi's father's land deal would fail and Obiora could quietly sweep in with alternative funding. Chica started noticing the change. Less champagne, no more delivery drivers arriving with dresses, and tense phone calls taken behind locked doors. The final blow came when a major business associate pulled out of a housing project, citing ethical concerns. Obiora knew what that meant. Adaobi had moved. She had made calls. He panicked. That night, he called his distant cousin, Uche, to visit Adaobi on his behalf. "Beg her," he said, pacing his study, now half empty. "Tell her I was confused. Tell her I didn't mean it." Uche found Adaobi holding her twins and reading quietly on a balcony. He stumbled through the message. Adaobi listened, then calmly said, "Tell him I don't respond to middlemen. If he has something to say, he can write it in pen and shame." Uche left silent. For the first time, Obiora wept, not because he lost money, but because he realized he had gambled away the only woman who truly mattered. The naming ceremony was nothing loud, yet it was unforgettable. Set in a minimalist event hall adorned with soft whites and golds, the ceremony held only 50 guests, but every one of them was a heavy name: oil magnates, tech investors, real estate elites. Adaobi, dressed in a cream lace gown and coral beads, looked like quiet royalty. She carried one twin while Muna held the other, both babies wrapped in identical white shawls. The pastor prayed over them, naming them Zipporah, show the world, and Tibena, God is enough. The press wasn't invited, but the whispers started anyway. "She's the new face of Omenka," someone said. "Obiora's finished," another muttered. Outside, Obiora appeared in a wrinkled suit, holding a small bouquet and shame on his face. He was stopped by two men in black suits. "Madam says you're not permitted beyond this point," one said. Obiora handed them an envelope, hoping to pass a message. Minutes later, a staff returned with a simple, typed response. "Mr. Obiora Nwachukwu has been permanently blacklisted by all oil subsidiaries under the Omenka umbrella. Any attempt to engage will be treated as legal breach." He crumpled the letter in his hand. Inside the hall, Adaobi whispered into Zipporah's ear, "Your father left us, but your future will never be fatherless." Chica's world began to collapse like a house made of borrowed scaffolding. At first, she dismissed the decline, canceled spa appointments, slower deliveries, and Obiora's growing silence as temporary glitches. But when she overheard Obiora cursing into the phone, begging a bank manager to delay foreclosure proceedings, the mask of luxury began to crack. She snuck out the next day and paid an unannounced visit to Adaobi, dressed in oversized sunglasses and shame. Muna almost slammed the door in her face, but Adaobi, now calmer than ever, welcomed her in with silence. "I didn't know," Chica said, trembling. "He told me you were barren and bitter. I had no idea you were carrying twins. Or that the file," her voice broke. "He knew about the $5 billion folder, but he said it was fake, that you were too weak to follow it through. He lied to both of us." Adaobi didn't flinch. She rocked one of her sons gently in her arms and looked up at Chica with a gaze so steady it pierced. "You both made choices," she said quietly. "But I made peace." Chica burst into tears, asking for forgiveness, but Adaobi said nothing more. She didn't need to. The power shift had already occurred, not with vengeance, but with grace. And Chica left knowing she could never return. While Lagos gossiped and speculated, Adaobi was executing chess moves in silence. Using trusted legal proxies and dummy corporations, she quietly bought out every asset Obiora had mortgaged, reclaimed lost lands under her late father's radar, and acquired majority stakes in key firms Obiora once depended on. She never made a public statement, never granted an interview. There were no social media rants or tell-all moments. She simply erased Obiora from relevance using nothing but a pen, patience, and precision. Boardrooms now spoke of her with deep respect. She doesn't raise her voice, but when she enters the room, people stand, one CEO whispered. Meanwhile, Obiora spiraled. His reputation tanked. Contracts slipped away. Clients vanished. Even Chica, unable to live without soft luxury, quietly moved out to her cousin's house in Surulere. Obiora attempted a few press stunts to regain sympathy, but no one paid attention. He tried to sue Adaobi, but every court rejected him. His signatures had already transferred every right to her long ago. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. And Adaobi, the woman he once called fragile, had become a fortress no storm could shake. Weeks later, Adaobi returned to the hospital for a postpartum checkup with her twins, now round-cheeked and full of life. As she stepped into the waiting area, dressed in a modest yet regal baboo, a nurse gasped softly. "It's her," she whispered. Nurse Uju, who had helped deliver the twins on that night of chaos, came rushing forward. Her face lit up, eyes shining with emotion. "You look like a woman God rebuilt from scratch," she said, hugging Adaobi tightly. "I remember praying that night as I held your wrist. I told God, this one has suffered enough. Let her win." And he answered. Adaobi smiled, holding back tears. She asked if there was any way she could give back, and Nurse Uju shyly mentioned the hospital's outdated maternity ward. 2 weeks later, a quiet press release went out. New Adaobi Nwachukwu Maternity Wing commissioned at St. Raphael Hospital, anonymously funded. Adaobi never stepped forward publicly, but every nurse, midwife, and new mother who walked those shiny tiles knew that strength had passed through the walls, in silence. Obiora sat alone in what was left of his study, the once sleek shelves now bare, the curtains drawn, and a thick envelope in his lap. The letter inside bore a gold seal and heavy words. A declaration from the legal trust of Chief Ikena Okafor, Adaobi's father, that Obiora Nwachukwu, and any entity bearing his name or bloodline, were permanently barred from any access, dividends, or inheritance tied to the Omenka oil portfolio. It was signed in Adaobi's handwriting, firm and exact. At the bottom was a postscript. "Some things cannot be undone. Let this be your inheritance, the memory of what you discarded." Obiora read it over and over, his eyes stinging, lips trembling. For the first time in years, he wept, not in arrogance, not from greed, but from the realization that he had ruined something sacred. The woman who once begged for his love was now a name even the banks feared. The life he mocked had bloomed without him. He clutched the letter to his chest and wept like a child, not for the money, but because he had finally seen what it meant to lose a woman of value. In the phase of this quiet storm, Adaobi walked slowly through the garden of her estate, the early morning sun casting soft light across the grass as her twin sons toddled beside her, gripping her fingers with tiny hands. The estate staff, always respectful, greeted her with quiet nods and admiration. The world outside might never know the full story, how a woman who was once discarded became the silent force behind a billion-dollar empire, but inside this space, everyone did. Adaobi didn't speak of her triumph, nor did she wear her wealth like a crown. Instead, she lived each day in quiet joy, feeding her sons, managing her late father's investments, and praying at dawn with tears of gratitude. As birds chirped and the boys chased each other with clumsy joy, her voice whispered within. "They thought breaking me would end me. But God allowed the breaking to prepare me. They forgot. I was not made of glass. I was forged in fire." And with that, Adaobi turned toward the rising sun, holding her children, walking not into revenge, but into destiny. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and share to keep the stories alive. More tales await on Compiler Tales.